Hello, AP US History. This is the YouTube study session for the short answer section. I'll be going over the Unit 6 short answer questions. The first question for Unit 6 asks you to evaluate the political, social, and economic development made by the United States during the Civil War. Political development was the Northern victory in the Civil War proved that the federal government, which is what the Northerners were fighting for, was more powerful than the state government power, which is what the Confederate government was fighting for. Even before the Civil War, the Confederacy had been asserting and claiming that states' rights to own slaves and anything else from tariffs to banks was more important than federal rights. But when they lost and the North won, President Lincoln was able to say that the United States federal government was more powerful. Also, you could reference the rise of the Republican Party to national prominence was a major political development. Social development was the successful ratification of the 13th Amendment, which brought an entire racial group of people into equal status by abolishing slavery and saying that they cannot be slaves anymore, and that were African Americans. So social development was the abolition of slavery by the 13th Amendment. There was also the rise of a lot of discontent and race and discrimination and anger due to the conscription and forced military drafts that caused the New York City draft riots. And so anger of white Irish Americans in urban areas, so big cities like New York, protesting and rioting over the forced military drafts, is another social development. Economic developments is anything that has to do with money or budgets. So the reemergence or the reestablishment of the national banking system to provide funds for the Northern War effort is an economic development. The first ever income tax used by the federal government took place. The passage of more tariffs was another economic development. So all are political, social, and economic developments. Number 2 has you identify or explain how the Emancipation Proclamation was a political action by Lincoln. And the Emancipation Proclamation was political because Lincoln had to play a balancing act. He had to be a politician. He only, as a military order, the proclamation only freed slaves in the Confederate States because there were some states in the North during the Civil War that still had slaves, and these were the border states, and they were very important for Lincoln to keep them in the Union. And so Lincoln had to play a political card as president. And by making the war about slavery, which is what the Emancipation Proclamation did in a symbolic way, he promised to end slavery by the time the war was over. Number 3, what made the Battle of Antietam significant to the Northern War effort? It was the first major Northern victory of the Civil War for the North, and it gave President Lincoln confidence for the Northern side that they were going to win, and so he was able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation after that and make such a bold statement about ending slavery. Number 4, why was it critical for President Lincoln to keep the border states in the Union during the Civil War? The border states were essential. They were allowed to have slaves, but Lincoln wanted to keep them because they had major transportation networks for railroads and rivers, and also many factories to produce war supplies. So these border states were essential to military strategy. Number 5, take a stance. Was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Evaluate whether more good or harm came out of the time period by citing 3 pieces of evidence from the unit. To this day, many historians establish Reconstruction as part success and part failure. It was part success because there were amendments such as the 14th Equal Citizenship Amendment and the 15th Equal Voting Rights Amendment that were major advancements socially for African Americans. There also was the Freedmen's Bureau that was passed and approved by the radical Republicans in Congress that provided education and job training for the former slaves, the African Americans in the South. At the same time as that happened, though, there were rise of terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and political corruption in President Grant's administration during the 1870s when President Grant was president. Also, the Reconstruction time period did not last as long as it needed to. The radical Republicans eventually gave up in 1877 when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected in the previous year in 1876. And so there was a compromise made that the radical Republicans would remove federal troops from the South if Hayes was voted into office. And so when those federal troops were removed, the Southerners were able to redeem themselves and come back to power. And these were former Confederates who did not want to give rights to black people. And so they would implement similar laws to black codes, but it was called Jim Crow segregation. And number 6 has you look at how was Lincoln's legacy upheld by his assassination. Lincoln died almost at the right time, you could view it, in April of 1865, because if he had lived, he would have had to deal with the complicated nature of Reconstruction and bringing the former Confederate states back in. Lincoln didn't have to deal with the radical Republicans who wanted to push for more racial equality when there were former Confederates who wanted to do the exact opposite. And Lincoln, being the politician that he was going to try to be a balance, and that was very difficult to do. And the president after him tried to fight the radical Republicans and got impeached for it. So Lincoln's legacy was really upheld by being assassinated. And that concludes the Unit 6 section review of the short answer part of our study guide. Please see any other units for help in those areas.